As Chris said, my name is Gary Ferguson. I'm the Education Coordinator at Seniors Rights Victoria. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm situated on Wurundjeri lands and pay my respects to Elders past and present. It's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce the forum's four key panellists who will bring their expertise and knowledge to focus on their respective areas and provide some commentary on the needs as we head towards the 2022 Victorian State Election. Ali Scott is Campaigns Officer for the Disability Resources Centre, a member-based advocacy organisation established in 1981. In 2017, the Disability Resources Centre published the findings of a public consultation into the accessibility of Victorian public transport, Transport for All. In 2021, the Disability Resources Centre joined forces with other disability organisations, aged care organisations, unions and environment agencies to form the Transport for All Coalition. Together they strive for a universally accessible public transport system. Elizabeth Drozd has been working in the community services and local government sectors since 1991. She is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Multicultural Community Services, Care Connect's Board Director, and a board member of the Western Region Aged Care Public Fund, which is a charity. In 2022, Elizabeth won Leading Age Services, Australia's Executive Leader Award, for her long history in providing advocacy to support the vulnerable in our community, championing anti-ageism, access to people with language barriers, and training. Elizabeth was a Victorian Multicultural Commissioner from 2008 to 2015. In 2019, she received a scholarship from the Harvard Club of Victoria to participate in Harvard Business School's prestigious Strategic Perspectives non-profit management course in Boston in the United States of America. Jennifer Evans commenced as a Seniors Rights Victoria community speaker in April 2011. Retired social worker, she has experience in the areas of family welfare and health, both in hospital and community settings. Jennifer has worked periodically as a relief advocate with Seniors Rights Victoria, answering calls relating to information about elder abuse and response to people experiencing elder abuse. She thoroughly enjoys the opportunity to meet a range of people to promote the understanding of, response to, and prevention of elder abuse offered through the Seniors Rights Victoria Community Education Group. Fiona York is Executive Officer for the Housing for the Aged Action Group. Fiona has been working with older people for almost 20 years in a variety of roles within the community sector, including elder abuse, community aged care, cultural diversity, and most recently in housing. She has postgraduate qualifications in community development, ethics and legal studies, and brings a social justice perspective to all aspects of her work. She has worked with Housing for the Aged Action Group since 2016 and has been in the Executive Officer role since May 2018, leading the organisation's strong commitment to diversity and advocacy for older people in housing stress. To begin with, I'm going to ask each panel member to speak for around about 5 to 7 minutes about their respective areas and what they would like to see included in the platforms for the Victorian State Election. Some of the asks might be in addition, as Chris has mentioned, to the COTA platform, or some might reinforce the COTA platform. I'd just ask for each panel speaker to repeat their area that they're going to talk on before they present. And at at the end of each panel speaker, we'll have a little bit of time for people to ask questions in the chat, which I'll solicit from Amanda. So to begin with, I'd invite Ali Scott.
Thank you very much, Gary. So my name is Ali. I'm here from the Disability Resources Centre, and I'm going to talk about accessible public transport. It's very good to see that COTA has issue 3, help Victorians get where they need to go. And I just want to expand on the focus on community transport to the importance of all of our public transport services. We think that public transport should be accessible with urgency, it's non-negotiable, and it's an essential priority for our next government. What does it mean when we say we want access? Well, what this is about is, regardless of your physicality, regardless of your needs, you should be able to access all public services safely, reliably, and independently. So our vision is for universal access on public transport. And this means whether you identify as someone with a disability or whether you're an older person and you might have a sensory or mobility impairment, or you might push a pram, or you may have an injury. This community is a very, very large component of our population. And all these people will benefit from universal access. And if you think that when public transport was first built in 1852, it was all about a hop-on, hop-off service. And the needs of our community have morphed enormously since then, as Chris has already mentioned. And I just want to make a quick nod to Ken's point too, that we've been building a city for cars, not a city for people. And it's time for us to change our course here. And this will also aid our environment agenda, as well as inclusivity. Now, the need for us to change our public transport was seen a long time ago, and I'm sure you all know that a piece of federal legislation was introduced in 2002 called the Disability Standards for Accessible Public Transport, and that set up the standards by which all public transport should be built in order for everybody to be able to use them. Now, there's been no comprehensive audit about how each state has managed to achieve its obligations according to the standards. But in 2020, the Victoria Auditor General's Department did an audit of the Melbourne tram network, and the outcome was damning. They saw that 15% of the tram network is currently accessible. We are so far behind in honouring our obligations. Why is inclusivity important? Well, look, firstly, it's required by law. Not only according to the disability discrimination law are we currently failing our citizens, but it's also all laws are subject to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Inclusivity has enormous economic benefits. Now, interestingly, there's been no governmental modelling around the cost-benefit analysis of inclusion, but we know it to be considerable from the beginning work that VAGO conducted. Similarly, there's been no analysis of the social return on investment. I just want to offer a very small insight into that. It's very hard to get under the skin of what it means to suddenly, or to live with being excluded from your public services, or to suddenly find one day that you can access your public service, but not you. What's that like? Well, a few months ago, one of our campaigners was returning from work in Shepperton. She pre-booked her train the day before, as you have to do if you use a mobility aid. She turned up on the platform, the train arrived. There's no accessible carriage on the console. She simply can't get on the train. So she sits there and the train just passes. And before she can get her phone to ring up and tell her colleagues what's happened, she can't stop crying. Now, this is a woman who makes me sad just to think about it. She's a grown-up, she has children, she has a mortgage, she'd had a really good day. It's so diminishing and erosive, fighting against these barriers every single day. It's not acceptable. Now, the needs of people with a difference are being overlooked here. year on year. So the tram upgrades, for instance, were being achieved with a certain positive rate a few years ago, but they've been slowing down because these needs are being overlooked. And when you think that these are people who are twice as likely to be unemployed, these are people who experience a disproportionate level of poverty and homelessness, these are the people whose needs are being sidelined. Earlier this year, we were in a meeting with the Department of Transport, and they said, you know, access on public transport, it's not that bad. Look, I'm sorry. Our government over the last few years has demonstrated a shock of lack of understanding. I just want to, as a final point, talk about the learnings that COVID has given us. And we know that it's taught us a great deal, but one thing is the importance of human connection. And public transport is like the wind between our wings, the wind beneath our wings, I beg your pardon. It connects us to people, to friends, to family, to culture, to community. I could talk about people who can only go and see their family on the other side of Melbourne once a year because that's all they can afford to do in an accessible cab. I can talk to you about people who have to book their social life 2 weeks in advance, again, because they're reliant on cabs. This public transport is essential for everyone. It's part of inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally, for that. I'd now invite the audience, if they have any questions or comments, to put them in the chat. One of the things that we did talk about earlier when we had our little chat before this forum was the accessibility for people living in regional and rural areas. Would you like to talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes, certainly. So obviously the infrastructure of public transport in regional and rural areas is fairly scarce. And so people are very reliant on wheelchair accessible cabs, which are themselves a scarcity and extremely expensive. I did just mention there at the end that one of our campaigners who says, you know, you have to book it 2 weeks in advance and then it might not come. People who run out of their NDIS provision very, very early on in the year, because it's, in terms of covering transport needs, it just doesn't cut it. So yes, and the assumption is that cabs will pick up the shortfall, but no, it's just not sufficient.
Right, thank you. Okay, all right, well, there doesn't seem to be any questions or comments coming through chat at this stage. I'll just explain to you that once the 4 speakers have finished, we will open it up for general discussion and questions as well. So you'll have an opportunity then to ask any questions about any of these issues. I'd now like to invite Elizabeth to talk about her area, which you'll identify at the beginning. And one of the things I think that is noticeable with the COTA platform is that there isn't very much mention of culturally and linguistically diverse populations.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Gary. So I'm really pleased to be able to present a multicultural perspective on what's been shared by Chris and Ellie. And in relation to the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse communities and how they can be met, it is very much about inclusivity, and I really like that. It really encapsulates sort of everything. So all the issues and priorities that were identified by Chris, clearly they all relate to ethnic communities and ethnic seniors. Some people may actually be affected by all of them or some of them. For example, housing in ethnic communities is actually the higher ownership. There's higher ownership, but clearly they are always people who do not have family support networks. You may be very surprised to hear, and I do have a senior citizens card, so I can actually speak as a senior, although clearly not someone who is experiencing barriers, but some people do. And but I've never had any family in Australia for the last 40 years. So when you actually are here, when you came under the refugee program or special humanitarian program, which is the category I came, we are affected by different issues, and we have to rearrange our lives in a way that can then, hopefully function well in the society. The biggest barrier and need that ethnic seniors experience is really that language issue. If I was speaking to you in my mother tongue, you would not be able to understand what I'm saying. And if I didn't speak English, I would not actually be able to hear and understand and participate in this forum at all. And that means that you don't have access to information, and information is power, and it's just a flow-on effect of that. The language fluency amongst ethnic seniors does vary. For example, in relation to digital inclusion, generally speaking, they are excluded even more. But with some communities, for example, the Asian communities, like Vietnamese community, they actually have a higher usage of the internet than the general population, Anglo-Celtic senior population in Victoria. But they do it in their own language. So again, if information is only available in English, again, that's a barrier. So I'm waiting for the census data to be released. The preliminary information that we have thus far doesn't actually give the information that is needed when it comes to being able to respond to the needs of ethnic communities. So I am told that this will actually happen this month, and that's really important. Where I work, we cannot do our work appropriately and respond to the needs of the communities, despite the fact that we actually specialize in this, without actually reliability and access to good statistical information. No statistics are perfect, but when we make priorities, when we make decisions about which communities we support, the first thing we do is, okay, what are the top 10 CALD senior communities in Victoria, because we are based in Victoria. Despite the fact that the Indian community is the largest community now, and it's a community that doubled in size in the population in the last 5 years between censuses, it's not a community that has the largest number of seniors. So it's really important. So knowledge is very important when we're making decisions about what we can do and how we can better respond in a more equitable and inclusive when it comes to the needs of senior communities, is really knowing that information, because Italian and Greek communities are the largest seniors now from ethnic backgrounds, and that's a reflection of the migration waves that occurred post-Second World War. We still have clients and seniors who we support who came here as displaced persons between 1947 and 1953. 170,000 were accepted, which was the largest refugee wave that ever came, compared to 2,500 of people who came in the late 70s and early 80s from Vietnam, known as the boat refugees. So what is the best way to respond to CALD communities being seniors? That's a question that can be asked by every government-funded organization, government departments, and all relevant stakeholders who, certainly from my experience in the last 30 years, there's genuine interest and commitment in wanting to do the right thing, but it can be a bit overwhelming. Ethnic seniors come from more than 200 different communities. They speak more than 100 languages. They follow, and that's all data from census information. They follow more than 140, I think, 3 different faiths and religions. So how do you respond to that? And my message is always the same whenever I'm asked to present about this. So one of the best ways, I believe, is actually to follow what's known as the access and equity principles in relation to CALD communities. They are actually applicable to people with disabilities and also, First Nations people. Plus, of course, we do some work with Indigenous organizations and communities, and I know there's another angle always that we need to say, because certainly the First Nations peoples are not people who like to be recognized as the Indigenous owners of the land that we are gathering on, and normally do not identify as being of ethnic backgrounds. So what are the 7 principles that can be used when we think about the needs of ethnic communities? So first and foremost, are our services and are we accessible as organizations? And does that access result in equity? Not equal access, but equity. You know, do we know that if 40% of the population is of ethnic backgrounds, let's say seniors, which is where at the moment the statistics is, do our organizations respond and you know, have about 40% of the actual clients or communities that we support? So that's number one. Number three is communication. As we know, communication will always come up. Communication by government departments, by private companies, telephone companies, you know, Optus having a security breach, all of that. In the end, it's the communication. We want to be, you know, kept up to date. We want to be informed so we can make informed choices. Number four is responsiveness. And I'm mindful that I've already used 7 minutes, so I won't be long. Responsiveness. So are we responding to the and sensitive to the needs of, you know, individuals and communities? Number five is effectiveness, which is, are we results oriented? Efficiency, are we really optimizing the use of what is known as and available as public resources, and making our services responsive and user-friendly, and etc. And accountability is the last one. Do we really report and do the right thing by the target groups that we are aiming to respond to? So, but first and foremost, we always ask for recognition and awareness that CALD seniors and CALD communities have at times different or additional needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I just, there hasn't been any questions come up yet, but I just wanted to go back to one of those principles that you talked about, which was communication. And I know that having worked with CALD populations, that doesn't necessarily mean a straight translation from an English document into the language. Did you want to talk a little bit about that and what it means when we're talking about being culturally sensitive?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's no organization in Australia, including AMCS, where I work, we cannot provide all information that a person needs. So, you know, sure, we can have these noble decisions made in, you know, ivory towers. And I'm sorry, I work for a not-for-profit. I can be as outspoken as I can. It's all on behalf of advocacy, on behalf of clients. You know, there are these noble decisions and principles and policies. For example, one of them is in relation to, you know, home care and services to support seniors at home, and including in residential care as well, is that clients are entitled and should receive information in a language that they understand. Sure, but at the same time, the government has made a decision that it's all customized and each person receives funding for their care, for example. So one person wanted a contract, 30-page, you know, those contracts prepared by lawyers that, you know, everything has to be included. To translate this was $3,000. It cannot be covered by the funding for that person. No organization can cover, you know, 50 languages and provide that maybe for one person. This person is from Timor-Leste. Her language is, I think, Tengulu. Unusual language, maybe that's the only person we have who speaks that language. So what we do is we constantly struggle every day. We do the best we can, and that's the only thing we can do. And that's the message from Harvard, by the way. For a week, all we listened, because there were 160 CEOs of not-for-profit organizations, and there was recognition of our limited resources. But as long as we do the best we can within the resources that we have, that is all we can do.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd now like to invite Jennifer Evans, who's going to talk about elder abuse and some of the asks which have already been mentioned by Chris, but to give us a little bit more detail and background about the issue.
Thank you, Gary. Just before I start, I'd like to just say as a volunteer how much I feel very privileged and valued to be part of a team, such an expert team as Seniors Rights Victoria. So elder abuse is any act which causes harm to an older person and is carried out by someone they know and trust, such as family and friends. So the abuse can take a variety of forms, such as emotional, financial, physical, deliberate neglect, another. So, and any older person, both men and women of any income level, of any cultural group, may become a victim of abuse. But many clients find it difficult to take action because the perpetrator is part of their family. The abuse can continue over a long period of time, and it can range from minor through to extreme mistreatment. Now, most clients might not have had any direct personal experience of abuse previously, which can make them feel very isolated and unaware that what is happening actually constitutes a form of elder abuse. The surveys have shown that between 12 and 15% of Australians over the age of 65 years have experienced some form of elder abuse. Now, if we applied this to Victoria, the number of people who have experienced some form of elder abuse would be about around 100 to 160,000 people. Big number. So elder abuse is a form of family violence, but the 2015 Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence recognised that elder abuse can be different from intimate partner violence, as it's often perpetrated by adult children and so requires a specialised approach. Now, operating since 2008, Seniors Rights Victoria is the only integrated legal and advocacy service specialising in elder abuse that covers the whole state. So it offers free, timely and expert legal advice and support to any older person experiencing abuse. It has a role in policy and advocacy, capacity building, and working collaboratively with relevant sectors across the community to better identify, address and prevent elder abuse. Now, in the broader community, it raises awareness of ageism, which is the main driver of elder abuse. And this is where the community educators, such as myself, have a role. Now, in doing so, Seniors Rights Victoria recognises that every older Victorian has the right to live with dignity and respect, including making their own choices about what action to take to stop the abuse. As one client said, being able to talk to someone gave me the power to make decisions. Now, as Chris said earlier, SRV is struggling for adequate funding to meet demand. The current casework staffing level funded by the Victorian government is 5 full-time positions, the same level as it was in 2012. Hardly adequate to meet the needs of those older Victorians who are being abused and mistreated in some way by their family. Now, the number of calls to the Seniors Rights Helpline has increased significantly as the service has become better known, and so has the complexity of the cases. Responding well to an older person takes time and expertise, but the increasing demand on the helpline for assistance and support means that staff are often under pressure to respond immediately, so they're limited in tailoring their response to value the older person and rebuild their confidence. When it works well, in the words of another client, she put my mind at rest and provided a lot of empathy. She understood, gave me a lot of advice and a lot of time. So this specialised approach is important. There's also a huge unmet need in rural and regional areas. As currently, the research shows that 70 to 80% of calls to the helpline come from the metro area. So what would additional and sustained core funding provide? Well, it would increase the number of specialist staff from 5 full-time positions to 10 full-time positions in the first year, and then increase incrementally as demand for its services increases. This funding will enable a more prompt response to those experiencing elder abuse. It would increase and improve the response for those from diverse populations and regional and rural areas. It would allow an additional worker dedicated to promoting the prevention of elder abuse, ensure older people across the whole of Victoria are aware of their rights. Now, additional core funding would continue and expand the work in policy and systemic advocacy, capacity building and stakeholder engagement. And I know this is an area in particular that Gary works so hard with all of the other agencies to build their capacity to understand and respond to elder abuse. It would allow additional administrative staff to support the work of the lawyers, advocates and policy staff to engage directly related to responding to the needs of older Victorians, thus ensuring their rights are protected and the prevalence of elder abuse in the community is reduced. So, as Chris said earlier, what we're asking for, we need the current members of government and all candidates in the upcoming state election to know that elder abuse does occur in our community, and that the only statewide integrated legal and advocacy service specialising in elder abuse, Seniors Rights Victoria, is currently grossly underfunded to meet the need. Seniors Rights Victoria needs an immediate increase in sustained core funding from the new state government so that they can improve and extend the response to elder abuse in the community and to fulfil its role advocating for the rights of older Victorians. Back to you, Gary.
Thanks, Jennifer. And that's been very informative background information in terms of the asks around Seniors Rights Victoria, but also in expanding the advocacy, which is really important in reducing elder abuse in Victoria. I mean, one of the things that we do know is that with family violence is that 20 to 30 years ago, intimate partner violence would be a matter for the family and no one else would be getting involved, including the police. And we know today, for example, that our awareness of family violence in that context and our unacceptability of it has increased enormously through awareness raising and campaigns and that sort of thing. Can you see elder abuse being at that point where people do have an increased awareness across the broader community if the funding is increased?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting when we go out to talk to community groups, and we're starting to do that again now after a big lull during the COVID period. People now, you know, we used to ask years ago, has anybody heard of seniors' rights? Has anybody heard of elder abuse? And people would, very few people would respond. Whereas now I think we are hearing a little bit more. We will have people put up their hands to say that they have heard of seniors' rights. And generally, there'll always be someone that comes up after the talk to give an example of either where they've been involved and or where they know a family member has been. But this is a very specialised group that we usually talk to. I mean, there is, and I know you're doing some work with the deaf community at the moment. So there's whole different segments of the community that really just haven't understood that what they're experiencing is elder abuse and that there is help in hand. And I think, obviously, the more that message can get out there, the more staff that Seniors Rights has, that you're duplicated, that the rest of your staff are duplicated, then the needs of those people are going to be met much better.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. I'd now like to invite Fiona York, the CEO of HAG, to present on the housing issue.
Thanks, Gary. It's lovely to be here, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land today, the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and to note that homelessness and housing insecurity disproportionately affects Aboriginal elders. As Gary mentioned, my name is Fiona York. I'm the Executive Officer of Housing for the Aged Action Group. We're known as HAG. We're a member-based organisation that's been around since 1983, working towards housing justice for older people. And we run the Home at Last service, which is a housing information service for people aged 50 years and older. We're one of only 2 specialist older persons housing services in the country. Around 60% of our clients are older women and around 50% are from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. I'd like to congratulate COTA Victoria for including the issue of housing in their election demands for the upcoming state election. It's so important because having secure and affordable housing underpins everything. It's vital for health and well-being, and it's impossible to age well or age in place without appropriate housing. It impacts on social connections. Elder abuse is both is caused by insecure housing, and housing is a solution to elder abuse in a lot of cases as well. The housing crisis for older people in Victoria is getting worse. Every day, our Home at Last service receives calls for people across the state who are facing eviction, are unable to pay the rent, who are experiencing inappropriate and housing due to their families' inability to hold them any longer as well. There's been a steep increase in the number of older people experiencing homelessness, as Chris mentioned at the outset, including older women. And we've just had a look in the last couple of days at the 2021 census data, which shows that there are more than 160,000 people aged 55 and older who are renting in Victoria. Older people need stable and affordable housing in order to age in place, and this can't occur in the private rental sector at the moment with our current housing laws and with the current cost of housing. At the moment, it's only 22 months, the average length of the tenancy in metropolitan Melbourne, and only 1% of available rental housing is affordable to someone on the age pension. So it's just not a viable option for older people to age in place. There's a really stark difference in the health and well-being of older people who are homeowners versus those who are renters. And if you look at COTA's State of the Older Nation report, you can see that older renters are more likely to rate their quality of life as poor. They feel older. They're more financially insecure and worried about paying the bills. They're less likely to have superannuation or private health insurance, and they're also less likely to exercise their rights or make complaints. Unfortunately, Victoria still has the lowest proportion of public housing stock in Australia. So we are 100% supporting the calls of COTA Victoria and VCOS to increase the supply of community and public housing to 60,000 over the next 10 years. We think that that is absolutely essential. As well as increasing the housing supply, there's a couple of other things that we're asking the Victorian government to do. One of them is to release the 10-year affordable housing strategy. And this was a new long-term approach the government announced last year to address housing supply, and most importantly, to put housing as a human right in the centre of our housing system. But unfortunately, it was shelved earlier in the year following backlash from the Property Council on a proposed levy for low-cost housing. And I noticed this morning that there's been some further announcements around that, which hopefully will be a good sign. But we really support a long-term view and support a 10-year affordable housing strategy. So we hope that the Victorian government will be now able to release that. Last year, I gave evidence alongside COTA Victoria to the Victorian Parliamentary inquiry into homelessness. That report has been released, but the government has not yet responded to it within the 6 months required. So we're really hoping that the Victorian government can respond to the recommendations in that report. They heard over 300 submissions from across the state. Not all of it was about older people, but older people were certainly represented. Similarly, we made a number of submissions to the Social Housing Regulation Review, which was an independent review into the social housing sector. It has also released a report, and it recommends a range of reforms that put tenants in the centre of the system. However, this too has not yet been responded to by government. The Victorian Ombudsman has been damning in her review of the complaint system for social housing, and she calls the system broken. One of her recommendations is that a housing ombudsman be established, and this is one of the things that we are also calling for. We'd like that to be extended, though, to include not just residents of public and community housing, but also residents of retirement housing, including both retirement villages and residential parks, who have been asking for an ombudsman since the Parliamentary inquiry in 2015. Dispute resolution in residential parks and retirement villages is fraught, it's difficult, it's expensive, it's long-winded, it's very hard for residents to exercise their rights, and so it's really important that an ombudsman can address those issues in that type of housing. We recently held a forum for residential park residents, and for those that may not be aware, residential parks are where the resident owns the dwelling, but they lease the land that it sits on by paying site fees. This type of housing is currently falling through the gaps of the Retirement Villages Act and the Residential Tenancies Act. And there are many issues in this sector that we're hoping that the Victorian government can have a look at in the coming term. The other major issue for older people and housing that we see is what we're calling the missing middle, which is older people, mainly older women, who have a small amount of savings or superannuation, which makes them ineligible for public and community housing, but they're unable to afford anything else. We don't have any data on this, the number of people that this affects. We have a lot of people coming to our service who fall into this category, but we're not sure across the population how many people this affects. And so what we're asking for is that part of the big housing build announcement that the Victorian government has promised for affordable housing, which they're thinking of as key worker housing, be earmarked for, around 20% be earmarked for that cohort of older women, particularly, who are falling through the gaps of the system. At the moment, when they call our service, there's very few options that we can give them. They're sitting in private rental, depleting their savings, and unable to access any other type of housing. And it's really, it's very bleak for that cohort. So overall, what we're calling for is a range of options that address the needs of low-income older people. The housing needs to be well designed, it needs to be adaptive to climate change, and it needs to be in places where people want to live, connected to their communities, to transport, to green spaces, to services. And that's the only thing that will prevent the incoming tide of homelessness for older people that we're seeing. The other thing that we're calling for is an expansion of our Home at Last service. We currently provide information to around 1,000 older Victorians every year, and we assist around 150 older people into long-term affordable housing, mainly in metropolitan Melbourne, but more recently into the Shepparton and Barwon regions as well. So we would like to expand that service so we can support more people in all parts of Victoria to find housing and connect them with services. We have an election strategy on our website, altertenants.org.au, and we're calling on people to join us in our campaign for better housing in the upcoming election and better services for older people, and also to combat ageism. So if this sounds like somebody you know, or you yourself are in housing stress, please feel free to get in contact with us and we can have a chat about housing options. I'll give the phone numbers out at the end or in the chat potentially, but obviously, if anyone is feeling uncertain about the future or their housing issues, please get in contact with Home at Last. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Fiona. That's been very informative. Look, you might have mentioned this and I might have missed it, but did you talk about the issue of older women who have been subjected to family violence, looking for housing and not being able to find it and then not having any options? And if you haven't, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so family violence is obviously one of the drivers of homelessness. It is a priority category on the Victorian Housing Register, which means that if you're experiencing family violence, you should be getting priority. Same with people who are 55 years and older. However, at the moment, the wait time for people is around 15 months to get into housing. And so that is a big issue. People basically have no options. And then even worse for older women who don't meet that criteria because they have too many assets, too much superannuation, then they really have nowhere to go. So it's a major issue, which is why we're calling on some type of affordable housing strategy, whether it be co-housing, whether it be cooperatives, whether it be a revitalisation of the independent living unit sector, which has been sold off. It needs to be something to address the needs of those older women.
Thanks very much. Excuse me. So there have been some questions that have come through during the panel presentations, and I might get some of you to address those now. There was one question which talked about in recent years, a genuine effort to engage and improve public transport by a COTA representative on various reference groups. The improvements are often budget limited, and the question is, how do we best ensure we are prioritising the actions for disability correctly? Ali, do you want to talk to that?
Yes, great. Thank you. Wonderful question. Yes, there is a budget for small upgrades, and it's always worth filtering through if there's a particular local issue that you have. They tend to, the Department of Transport can deal with those fairly quickly. But in terms of the broader agenda, the only answer is lobbying. So last year, a group of complainants, including an older Victorian, took a case to VCAT about inaccessibility of public transport. It came to nothing. So our complaint process is broken, and lobbying is all we have. So the potential for all of our campaigning communities that we have here at this meeting today to come together and force the government to take notice of their legal obligations and do the upgrade work required across the board is what we want to see. We've got a letter writing campaign which we're launching this afternoon leading up to the election, and we'd really love your participation. If you have a moment, that will be on our website this afternoon.
Great, thanks, Sally. And what we might do is get you to flick the details of that to Amanda, and then she can circulate it. Would that be okay, Amanda? I'm saying it's okay anyway. Okay, so moving on to another question. One of the things that came up during the presentation around culturally and linguistically diverse populations, Elizabeth, was the issue of internet access, and how this, you did talk about, for example, how the older Vietnamese population had a significant usage of the internet, but I would imagine that that's the exception, and that, for seniors in a lot of instances who are from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, their internet access may be limited by a whole range of reasons, including language and budget. Do you want to talk to that question as well?
Yes, thank you. So certainly very relevant, and I know it has emerged as an issue where people who are on pensions and pensions only, and that applies to any senior, and may have significant health needs. For example, that means that they really need to be very careful with what they use the pension money for. Having the internet subscription that came up as an issue during the digital inclusion projects that we've been running, and we've certainly really increased it significantly when COVID started. We were aware of the barriers that existed before. We were fortunate to get some funds from a charitable trust, right, who really supported this, and that resulted in 80 bilingual digital mentors for seniors, right, including some of our staff volunteered. So that was absolutely amazing. It is doable. Clearly, we cannot do everything on a voluntary basis. Sometimes there are some funds needed to facilitate and tap into the goodwill that exists in multicultural communities and the general community. And so it was absolutely great. Normally project funding and charitable funding is normally for a year or a bit longer. Be Connected is a fantastic initiative, and again, we are part of that. We're continuing that process, and it's absolutely great when a CALD senior starts with needing a whole table to operate the mouse, and they are given an A4 piece of paper and saying, this is your space for the mouse. And to then for me to get emails from them and for them to be active on Facebook. I mean, the satisfaction from actually connecting someone, to actually the digital world is absolutely fantastic. So whatever we can do, but yeah, it's so that's what it is. But certainly and lucky, there is some flexibility, and again, that's the benefit of COVID, the flexibility that governments have put in place regarding some of the funding that exists, where in fact we as a service provider could actually purchase an iPad or a phone for a senior and then have a digital mentor volunteer to help them with that process. And in fact, it is actually possible, for example, with the home care package funding to actually pay for someone in a paid capacity to actually support a senior to be able to increase their independence and empowerment to be able to function. The interest has to be there, of course. We do have some seniors who actually don't even want to have a mobile phone, and they still have a landline. So there's only so much you can do. Some seniors don't take to it. And I can completely understand that. There's just so much that's gone online that even people my age, it just feels a bit much, really.
Yes.
And it can be overwhelming, of course.
Yes, agreed. I agree with you totally. Okay. So one of the things that came up while you were talking, Fiona, a person commented on that they were very impressed with all your data. And that we should be taking the needs of and solutions of homeless people more seriously. Do you think one of the solutions is to appoint a minister to help work for this solution? Maybe a minister for homelessness or someone who's specifically appointed to address that issue?
Yeah, federally, there's a homelessness minister. On a state level, there's the housing minister, recently come into the position with Richard Wynn's departure. So it's definitely in his ballpark to be looking at these things. I think one of the challenges is that the sector and the older people themselves and anybody that's experienced homelessness in the past knows the solutions. We have the solutions. It's just about the political will to implement those solutions. So rather than reinventing the wheel and coming up with yet another innovation, we know what works. What we need to do is pressure those decision makers to put it at the top of their priority list and see housing and safe and affordable housing as underpinning everything to do with health and well-being and social connections and all of those things. We really saw that in COVID. People suddenly realised how important it was to have housing, and we could all of a sudden get all of the rough sleepers off the street into hotels pretty much overnight. So if there's a lever, then people will act, but otherwise it's just not prioritised. So the more people speaking about it and talking about this issue to government and recognising the importance of it underpinning for all health and wellbeing and ageing in place and home care packages and all of the things that we've discussed today are underpinned by safe and affordable housing.
Sure. Look, just this will be the last question because we have to move on in a minute, but there was a question around elder abuse and how can we ensure that it's taken more seriously by other places and other organisations and agencies. And the question was really about how can we ensure that incidences are acted on promptly by politicians, policymakers, the police, court system, health professional and others, and what can we as ordinary advocacy and awareness. So Jennifer, what I might do is get you to answer the latter part of that question, which is what can we do as ordinary members in the community to support the advocacy and awareness. And I might just flag with Chris that maybe he could talk about the first part of that question, which related to getting others to respond more promptly. So Jennifer, over to you.
Yeah, look, it is about awareness, isn't it? I guess the work that we do in talking to seniors groups, that's very much about awareness and making sure they know that there are pamphlets and booklets to give to their neighbours, to encourage their family members, etc., to let them know that there is help out there. And it's being aware of the issues, and I guess it's all the issues we've been covering today, having them ready to talk about. I'll just give one quick incident, and I know we're going to talk more about how do we lobby for all of these things. But last week I had a call from my local state member's office to, they're doing the rounds saying, what are the issues for the upcoming election? So he got me at a good spot. As well, first up, I gave him full barrel on one topic I won't go into today. But then I said, I'm on a panel next week. Is he aware, of elder abuse? Will they be involved, etc.? So I suspect the guy I spoke to didn't have a clue about elder abuse and didn't really know about seniors' rights. However, yesterday I did send the link and the information about today's COTA event to the local member. And I got an email back this morning to say, thanks for that. Yes, we are aware. We have lots of people coming in about elder abuse, and they have close, because it's at Box Hill, they have close connections with the Eastern Legal Service that has a speciality in elder abuse. So it is being aware that at every opportunity, they will be phoning us. So we talk about housing, we talk about disability, we talk about, cold issues, and we talk about elder abuse. So it's taking opportunities to spread the word to whoever.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Chris, did you want to make some comments about the other part of that question, which was how do we get policymakers and politicians to respond promptly to incidences of elder abuse? And you're on mute at the moment.
Yes, thanks, Gary. And it's a really, really great question from Lynn. And it's not a simple question by any means. There are so many components to that we could break down and talk probably for the remainder of this time. But if you look at, I'll give you an example. When Lynn asked the question, and I'll break this up if I can. We'll get to politicians and policymakers in a minute. But if we focus on the police, court system, health professionals, and others, I think there needs to be an understanding that in Victoria in particular, and probably more broadly nationally, we don't have what you would refer to as integrated justice services. Integrated justice services, there could be a plethora of organisations and entities that represent a lot of those areas of the court systems and drug and alcohol, mental health, all these other professional organisations, like-minded organisations that work in the same system. So elder abuse, if that's the starting point, and then the police and all the other entities that get involved. If it's an integrated, collaborative service that assesses every step of that abuse and how it's dealt with, then there is a lot more awareness and a lot more policy change and law changes. At the moment, we don't have anything like that. We have a very small version of that in central Melbourne and Collingwood, but it's a tiny little precinct that probably no one knows about. So Elizabeth would know when I was in Wyndham. I was a CEO in Wyndham there, and for a fairly powerful little lobbying group, and I advocated and chaired, the Wyndham Integrated Justice Precinct Advisory Group. That took, 4 years to get that group up and running and get the decision makers, the politicians, to actually support that. And how did I do that? To answer the next question from Lynn. We did that by, we engaged a university. They did a very comprehensive evidence-based study, Deakin University, on the lack of integrated justice precinct services in Wyndham in particular. And that was a very, very confrontational study by Deakin University. So what did I do with it as the CEO of the lobbying group that I was running on behalf of the community? I went to the Attorney General, to the ministers, to all the other politicians, and I said, in about 2 weeks, we're going to go public with this. We're going to be very overt in our language, in our media releases in relation to the damning findings of this study. So that overt lobbying strategy and engagement, which Ali touched on, Elizabeth touched on as well. When you talk about like-minded entities, like are here today in this very important event, it's very, very important that there's a collective, collaborative approach to addressing these things. Okay, and the second part, or the first part of that question, Lynn, go to your local MP, and I couldn't imagine a better time than right now to do that. Okay, they're just about, we're at the precipice now. We're in October. They're going to go into caretaker mode very, very soon. Okay, then probably a week or 2 weeks away from caretaker mode. So you have a very short window to really make sure that your MPs are actually doing their job. Okay, so that's I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much. That's been very helpful. Okay, look, that finishes the panel discussion and questions. I think if there is one takeaway from this, it's that we need to lobby
and we need to raise awareness about the issues. And the way to do that is through a number of means. I mean, Ali's talked about a letter writing campaign, and certainly at the end of this forum, there will be information about how we can take the platform forward to the candidates for the next state election. And it sort of segues into the next section. And I'm going to, before I do that, I should thank all our panelists for coming along today and for giving your time. It's been very informative, and it's been inspirational as well in terms of energising the group, I think, to take these matters on board.